Thank you. It's April 1st. Happy April Fool's Day. Welcome to another episode of Code Concepts with myself, Pete Roque, and my co host, Rachel Patterson. Rachel is unable to join us today, but we have a special guest. We have Jorge Rivera with the People's Resource Center. And Jorge is an advocate for people in substandard housing conditions and low income housing. I've met Jorge. I had the privilege of meeting and working with Jorge through the California Healthy Housing Coalition. It's collaborative with many jurisdictions throughout California to make sure that people have good indoor air quality, substandard, meet minimum standards of living, and those awesome good things. So, with that, how you doing, Jorge?
I'm doing well. How you doing, Pete? Good to see you.
Awesome. I'm doing great. I'm doing great. Thank you for joining us today. We have a lot to talk about. So today's episode is, us as code enforcement officers, we tend to visit a lot of, we get a lot of complaints for substandard housing, and a lot of our officers don't know what to say to some of these folks. And we don't know housing law. We don't know, what kind of things are available for the people in these type of conditions where we can point them in a specific way. So one of the things that Jorge does is he's a very big advocate of making sure people live in habitable housing, so healthy habitable housing. So with that, Jorge, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? How I know you didn't grow up one day and say, hey, I want to be the People's Resource Center main guy on YouTube. So can you tell us a little bit
Right.
of how you got started, where you're from, how you got into this whole industry?
Absolutely. I was pretty much born and raised here in Southern California. Actually, not born. I was born in Chicago, but I was raised here since like they're 3 years old, and I lived in Southeast LA in Southgate for up until I went to college. I went to Cal State Long Beach, and I kind of stayed in Long Beach for about close to 25 years before just recently moving out. And sort of in the latter part of that period of being in Long Beach, I started to just like get involved in the community, volunteer in different nonprofits. And then I came across a group that was advocating for tenants' rights and affordable housing. And I became really interested. And at that time, I had a lot of free time. And so I just volunteered for them to learn more about tenants' rights, because I had been a tenant at the time and didn't know anything about my rights. And so I wanted to know what they knew, and I wanted to learn about what they were trying to do, which was to ensure that people were living in healthy homes and safe homes, to ensure that there was enough affordable housing available for people to deal with like the homelessness population, that people's rights were being upheld, and just the whole tenant landlord relationship, right? And so I've been doing that ever since. And so I've been doing tenant advocacy and tenant organizing for over 10 years now. I established the People's Resource Center about 2 years ago because there seems to be a need to get information and education out to tenants about what their rights are and how to advocate for their rights. And so we started the tenant counseling hotline, because as a tenant organizer, I can organize tenants, and I can help them advocate for their rights, help them advocate for healthy homes and things like that. But there seems to be a lot of time that's taken up just dealing with people's habitability issues and other issues, that an organizer's time gets split up. So, and I decided to support the organizing community by doing the tenant counseling hotline. And once you resolve to people's tenants issues or habitability issues, then they can get more involved in the advocacy and the organizing part of it. So yeah, so I've been doing tenants rights stuff for over 10 years. And yeah, it's just a passion of mine, and it just intersects with so many other things like health. It intersects, like we try to incorporate, like in our YouTube videos, we incorporate a lot of wellness practices, because it's a stressful thing living in an uninhabitable home, or like you got roaches crawling around, or you can't sleep because you're getting bitten by bed bugs, or you can't breathe because there's mold. and that can weigh on you, and then that transfers into your job, it transfers into your social life, it transfers into your relationships out in the community, and it permeates so many different facets of our lives, that I think that living in a healthy and a safe home is so vital to not only just our health, but just our being in community.
One
So
of the
yeah,
things,
that's another.
Jorge, that I noticed, in working in healthy housing, I really tend to look at people's situations sometimes, because I grew up in Long Beach as well. I grew up where now is what they call Chavez Park. That whole
Yeah,
area had to be demolished because it was so substandard. I lived in a three-story building, and the Press Telegram did an actual article on the place where I was living as the worst place where you could possibly live. We had cats living in the walls. It was pretty, to me, that was normal. To me, as a child
yeah,
growing up, seeing roaches running around, that was normal. And and I lived in a one bedroom apartment with like three other families growing up, because we were super poor. And to us, that was a norm, because it happened throughout the whole. And we didn't know any better. We didn't, we didn't know what tenants' rights were. Well, as a kid, I didn't know. I didn't really care. All I know is like, hey, don't make too much noise, because then the neighbor's gonna get mad, and yeah, things like that. But there was a lot of issues. I remember there was mold throughout. Like, the laundry room was full of mold. To me, as a kid, I was like, it's dirty.
yeah,
I didn't recognize that. And talking to a lot of these code officers that been through that type of substandard housing, they grew up in similar things that we're now enforcing. And a lot of people are sickly because of the mold, and they didn't know it was because of that, the air quality,
yeah,
dust, dander, all those kind of things. Same thing with roach infestation. People don't realize that the sheddings of thorax, and the little fecal matter that causes a lot of stuff on your health as well.
right,
So one of the reasons why I personally got involved with the California Healthy and Housing Coalition, is where we met, is because they're big advocates for making sure there's a minimum standard of living for folks throughout California. The collaborative between there's groups out there that they're primarily focused on people not getting taken advantage of, as far as overpriced rent, or they have fear of deportation, or those kind of things. So I think it's really important for code officials like myself, and to be able to see how we personally can relay the information. And today's show is primarily based in California, because Jorge is in California, and he deals with California tenants rights. But across the United States, the habitability is similar. You shouldn't be living in mold. You shouldn't be living in pest infested homes. And people don't realize that sometimes these have a very, like you said, effect on people's social life. Because as I got older, I went to a primarily more affluent school. So I was I used to be bused to a different county. So I was looking at people with like the big houses and the
mm,
mansion. I here living in a three-bedroom substandard apartment. So there's no way I was going to invite them over to my house.
no,
So
yeah,
and it weighs on people, and there's a psychological thing. People. I met people that are afraid to bring their dates back to their home, because they're afraid of
oh,
it.
absolutely,
They get, they're getting romantic, and I turn on the lights, and you have like a whole audience of roaches, you know, but it gets to the point where it's really bad, where you're talking to a resident during the day, and normally a lot of these insects are nocturnal. They thrive in the dark, and during the day they're crawling on like a baby's face, and are going into the ear, and it causes all sorts of stuff. Now, can you tell us some of the kind of calls that you get at the call center on types of help? Just kind of like like maybe some of the more like top two, three, and then we'll discuss it and based on a code enforcement type of issue. So
yeah. Well, I mean, I think the most common one has to do with infestations, and that's usually roaches, um, and I think I want to go back to something that you pointed on and something that I want to communicate, because I think that there's, in my experience, because I've dealt mostly with sort of like the Long Beach code enforcement, and in my experience, there's a disconnect between the tenants and sort of like the code enforcement, like a misunderstanding. And I think that it would be really important for like code enforcement. I know that they're not able to necessarily impose like civil related issues like tenants' rights, because that's not their job, right? But if they understood what the rights of a tenant were, then maybe they can better advocate for the tenant, right? For example, with roach infestations, if the we get most of these all the time. There's one building that I can think of. There's several actually, but there's one that I'm gonna talk about where they've just, like you said, the roaches are getting into the food. The roaches are getting into the refrigerator. The microwave has gone down a couple of times because they're getting into the microwave, and because this is where they like to go. They like to go where there's moisture, and they like to go where there's warmth. And I think that if there was a better understanding of tenants' rights, that the code enforcement can use the relationship with the tenants as an allyship, and can work together collaboratively to get the issues fixed. There's a warrant of habitability that a property owner owes the tenant when they lease or rent the apartment, and that's written in California Civil Code. So if the tenant has that right to a habitable and safe place, and it's code enforcement's job to enforce health and safety codes, then I see that there's a natural alliance there. There's a team, and sometimes the tenants, they're really leaning on code enforcement to help them because they have a non-compliant owner, right? And I think that the objective of both code enforcement and tenants and tenant advocates like myself is the same. We want to get the place to a safe and a habitable condition, right? So I think that if we're able to work together, tenants and code enforcement, I think that we can have a much stronger team and reach our goals much better than that.
I would agree with that statement. One of the things that there's a new bill, AB 838. I know the California Healthy Housing Coalition was a big advocate of it. So was the California Association of Code Enforcement. And one of the things that this bill said was, starting July 1st, if a code enforcement division does get any type of call on a substandard living condition, we have to respond. And same thing with if we get a complaint about lead, we have to respond. Back then it wasn't there. You being in you had dealing with these advocacy groups, some of these code enforcement divisions on, well, call the health department, or do this, or I've been in jurisdictions where we tend to kind of pass the buck to that, because we didn't have the training or the experience to deal with substandard housing. Now, as the climate's changing, so is the need for us to kind of start understanding why what causes mold. Maybe it's a leaky, maybe there's an air leak, there's a water intrusion, there's a roof leak. And so we have to look at these primary causes of what's going on. So we are starting to get questions, Jorge. So we're gonna
Yeah.
ask some of the questions. So here's a first question. Number one, hey guys, I'm curious. This is from James Hartley. I'm curious about your experience with smart rodent trap technology, or how do you handle managing rodent infestation? So I'll answer that one first on the code enforcement side. So we do get evidence of like rodent infestation. One of the things that the International Property Maintenance Code allows is it's not you shouldn't have a rodent infestation period. It's in that code. Many cities have adopted it. It's not standard across our industry. It should be. I know we talked to the California the Building and Safety Commission in regards to adding it to the books that should be explored when adopting our building codes. But some cities still are using the 1997 Uniform Housing Code, which is, you're talking 1997. I mean, I'm wearing my 80s gear today. It's a little bit, just a little bit older than that. But, and I think it's time for some of these jurisdictions to start looking and, updating, because the International Property Maintenance Code gets updated every couple years. So there's new things that can be added, especially if you have enough a voice and, goes through the proper channels, hearings, and the commissions, and you're able to add more things to help the substandard conditions. So one of the things that the International Property Maintenance Code does do is allows you to ask for a professional evaluation, a professional report, and also something that says, hey, we're solving this issue. This issue is solved. It's certified by a certified exterminator. So these are kind of tools of our tool belt that a lot of people don't know that we have. And the more you understand that these type of tools, the more you can enforce them. So on now, so Jorge, on your side, what can one do if one has a complaint about rodent infestation?
Well, I mean, again, like we deal with the tenant's rights side of things, so we always initiate the conversation with the owner because it's the responsibility at the end of the day of the owner to maintain a habitable living space. So we always recommend that the tenants first document and request for maintenance and repairs, and then follow suit. If they don't get a response, the state of California says that a reasonable amount of time is around 30 days. But I say that it depends on what the issue is, because if I got a non-working toilet, I'm not going to wait 30 days for the landlord to respond. I need that toilet fixed now. So some issues are going to be more immediate than others. But we start it with the letter. We give the property owner or the manager a reasonable amount of time to respond, and then the next step, the recommendation, is that the tenant call out code enforcement, and then that's when we have them or direct them, or we even assist them on calling code enforcement, or we call a code enforcement on their behalf to request an inspection, and then we try to work with the code officer to remedy the situation, and utilizing like the tenant's rights and what we have in our tool belt to try to make it happen. I saw a question that came in around like what are some things that I suggest to bridge the gap between code enforcement and tenants. Well, I mean, Pete, and several other code officers are the exception to the rule. In my experience, code officers seem to be very disconnected from the experience of the tenant. And so I think that, like you said, this is psychological, and there's a lot of shame that comes with living in bad conditions. And then also there's a lot of unworthiness, because like you said, like you mentioned, Pete, you and so many others that we come across, they just, maybe they come from poorer beginnings. And so they just almost believe that this is normal, and they accept that this is some sort of normality. And so there's some work that we have to do to try to educate them and inform them. Is like, no, it's like, you deserve more, right? You deserve a safe and habitable place to live. That's the contract that you entered into with the owner and the manager. And I think for code enforcement, having them understand kind of like the emotional and the mental state of tenants and what they might be going through, they like, because a lot of them are so scared to call code enforcement. They're so fearful, because maybe they come from another place that has like a lot of corruption in the government, or they come from a place where they don't, like, say in Long Beach, there's a huge Cambodian community.
Yep.
And look at their history, and look at their government, and look at why they had to flee their country to come here. It's like, they're not going to trust authority. They're not going to trust like the government. They're going to have a very a very distinct distrust of them. And a lot of the tenants that we come across that maybe are non-English speakers, they don't trust either. And so I think if a code enforcement officer understands kind of where the tenant is coming from, there might be some training for like emotional intelligence, or some sort of emotional emotional based training for code officers, I think that they can approach the situation a little bit differently and gain the trust of the tenant, and then work in coordination with them to try to get things fixed. So yeah, I think training, but that's like sort of like what we do, what we're saying, like for police officers, right? Is like, they need additional sort of like emotional, racial bias type of training. I think code enforcement officers can definitely benefit from something like that as well. I think it'll make their lives easier.
I would agree with that. And, I've talked to you about the frustrations with, tenant advocacy groups. You're not the first one and tells me, hey, you get it, but all these other code enforcement officers don't get it. And one of the reasons why we have this forum is because I want to tell other officers, hey, there's ways to work with these tenant right groups, because, they're humping their, they're busting their tail trying to get them some work and help them out. And we have the authority and the responsibility to enforce these codes. And I think Cecilia put on a code here earlier, the IPMC 309.1 does talk about rodent infestation. So does California Healthy Code 17920.2A. So she's very technical on this stuff. So, and if you ever took one of Cecilia's courses, she really talks. She gets down. She brings bed bugs too, and tells people these are what bed bugs look like, and this is their life cycle. Somebody always tries to steal her bed bugs, which is, we laugh. And but she, during her class, she's like, hey, when you go to a hotel, this is how you do it, or this is how you not bring roaches home, or and for folks that live in these, and we tell people, hey, don't buy, don't something simple as educating somebody. Hey, if you're, don't buy electronics at a yard sale, or don't buy this at a yard sale because you're bringing extra guests home with you. So we do have a lot of questions and we do have a lot of comments. One thing I do want to tell you is, beforehand, we spoke about this and educating more, the Spanish speaking community on what they can do, because us as, and I tell you, I do a lot of presentations. You've seen some of my presentations. And, the first thing when I do a Spanish presentation, I ask people, who knows what a code enforcement officer is? Nobody ever raises their hand. When I say, who knows what the city is? The city's they're gonna call the city. They're gonna get you. Everybody raises their hand. And I go, guess what? I'm the city. Yo soy la ciudad, And then they all look at me and then like, they're cool, but they're not cool, And then I educate them on what it is, why I'm there. And, and then of course, I get the, like, hey, what if my cousin, staying in the garage, and, if the neighbor calls, I'm like, okay, did the neighbor call your cousin? Yeah. So then we'll talk, this is what you can do. And this is, and then now explain new California law that says you can actually convert your garage into a living space. So there's different things that California is doing to help some of these substandard issues or the housing crisis. So, even though many cities don't agree with it, and it's changing the landscape of their neighborhoods, sometimes, the bigger picture is, some of these folks need a place to live. So we do have some places. So first one is from our friend Cynthia Velasquez. So Cynthia is actually going to be doing some Spanish stuff with us in educating the public. So is Minnie Garcia and Cecilia Muela. So we have, and hopefully we'll work with you and partner with you and do some stuff together up and down the state with healthy housing. So so here's the question: how about if there's a substandard code case and the tenant calls in, but they have been served with an eviction notice? They're refusing to pay rent, and now their lawyer's involved. Do we open a case for documentations, then inspect after? So here's my answer, Cynthia. A substandard condition exists. Nobody should be living in a substandard condition, whether they're going through an eviction or not. Just because that's the case, the conditions are still present. So if it's an imminent thing, you have to respond. If there's some injunction that we're not allowed to, because if somebody's living in a substandard, we're like, oh yeah, you got 30 days on your eviction. No, it needs to be immediately. To me, it doesn't really matter. We need to take action. A lot of times you have to talk to your city attorney, building official, what the best course of action is. In my experience, if it's substandard, we're going to act on it today. We're not going to wait a week. We're not going to wait a month. We're not going to wait the 60 or 90 days that California says, hey, you know what? Guess what? There's relocation protocols where, yeah, you can put them while they fix your place and then come back and then get evicted. There's a lot of things that somebody can do. So that's on our part. On your part, Jose, what is something that if somebody's going through an eviction, I know you get into that sticky situation with evictions.
Yeah.
What happens there?
Well, it depends on. I guess your answer is the answer that I would go with, regardless of what's happening on the civil side. I think that if it's an uninhabitable place, code enforcement should still go and inspect. Reason being is because regardless of what happens with that tenant situation, another family is going to go live in there,
Yeah.
right? And it could be children, it could be, and so we don't want the next family to come in to be exposed to the same uninhabitable living conditions that that tenant had to deal with. And if it, depending on the type of lawsuit and the type of lawyer that is involved, it might, if it's the tenant's lawyer, it might help the tenant to have a third party inspection report of stating all of the code violations, right? And so there we work with attorneys that do affirmative cases where they actually sue the owner or the insurance company of the building for not maintaining habitable living conditions. And it's those third party inspection reports that really help out the case, because it's not just the tenant saying it, it's the city saying it.
Yeah.
Right. And so now you have two people, and then you have the city actually saying that these issues exist. It totally helps out the lawsuit on behalf of the tenant when it comes to that. Then you have a really bad actor property owner, right? So
And
I would say, yeah, totally go for it.
yeah, one thing that code officers should take in consideration when you walk into some of these places, make sure if you know it's a bad condition, you normally can make a quick assessment. Use your personal protective gear, because you know what, there's no way you should be walking into a place full of mold, because it could cause long-term respiratory. Even though it's normal for some folks, it may not be normal for you. Sometimes we walk into these hoarding conditions with excessive cat urine and pneumonia, and we're walking in like, hey, no. Even though those folks have been exposed to it for years, their body's used to it. Our bodies aren't, and a lot of times we can be exposed to those dangers. Sometimes we can bring critters home. I've been in places where I use my Tyvek suit. Fleas love white. So by the end, by the time I look dirty, but it's just nothing but fleas on my Tyvek suit. So it's very important that you understand when to don PPEs. That's another safety officer safety component. So we do have a lot of questions. So let's go to the next one. This is from YouTube. This is from Mr. Joseph Liff. Some citizens I encounter need help of a social worker agency, but don't know how to get it. How can code enforcement officers connect them to services available? Now, so that sounds like a code enforcement question, but I know you have some on your side too. Sometimes we do experience where we do go into places where it's just. I've been to places where, there's a lot of pets. There's excessive feces all over the floor. Kids crawling around. You have to do your due diligence and contact the proper place for care, whether it be child protective services, adult protective services, mental health specialists, whoever. You as a code enforcement officer or division should have a list of resources available. A lot of times, if your agency is contracted with a county, you should have those county contacts available, because it's so important for you to know who to call. Because you leaving somebody in a state of help, needing help. It can come back. I'm telling you from experience. I wish sometimes I would have done more at a given situation. Now my experience says I have to act today. Waiting around is not an option for me nowadays. Back then it was, because I was young. I'm like, oh, I have 20 cases. I have to get 20 cases. If I get stuck here, I'm gonna get stuck here all day. Sometimes, you know what? That's what it's about, quality, not quantity, when it comes to code enforcement. So, on your side, when you do see something on the tenant advocacy group that you should report, how do you guys handle that, Jose?
Well, it's a hard one, to be quite honest, because I think I don't know if code enforcement officers are mandated reporters, um, but I think mandated reporters
Yeah.
typically, if they encounter something like that, they have to report it and then sort of let the other agency sort it out and try to fix it. It's a difficult one because, like you shared, Pete, that when you were growing up, that you had like three families in a really small apartment. And I mean, the overcrowding conditions that we're experiencing today because of the housing crisis can actually produce a lot of these living conditions, right? So it's not necessarily a lack of attending to the conditions of the home, but it's just that there's so many people in the home that things get in disarray. And so I mean, that's easily solvable if everybody had an affordable place to live, and then they can all sort of maintain their own units. So it's a tricky one. I think that personally, when I go into a home, I try to have a conversation about the unsafe conditions that I see, and offer them solutions on how to remedy some of those unsafe and unhealthy conditions before actually moving forward. Because if they have information and they're giving some sort of solutions, and we can help them take some of those steps to solving the issues, then maybe we can avoid having some like child protective services come in and doing so. So I try to, like, again, understand what's actually taking place, understand the context. I know that maybe code enforcement officers, because they work for the city, may not have that same leniency, but from my standpoint as a nonprofit going into community, I try to work with them first before reaching a point where I have to report to some sort of third party agency like CPS or Child Protective Services or something like that.
Understandable. So here's another one. We have let me see. I personally wish I heard tenants more often. One of the biggest part of my job is being able to improve conditions for them. Yes, I think
Yeah.
when we're in this industry, at the end of the day, we're here to improve people's quality of life. That's Rachel Patterson's motto: improving quality of life through community services and outreach. So she's a very big advocate of tenants right, and she's so bummed that she wasn't here. She just texted me saying, "Oh, I was there." She needs to do something, but yeah. But let me see. Here's another one. Part of my fear maybe dwelling may be declared uninhabitable. Now they're out of place to live. So here in California, there are some places for relocation services. At the end of the day, the property owner is responsible for ensuring that somebody lives in a habitable space. And then guess what? If I have to red tag the property because it's gotten that bad, what it's telling me, it's either you are negligent and you are not maintaining a minimal standard. I'm not saying you have to have a home and house and garden, magazine cover on your, apartment complex, but you have to meet the minimal standards, which isn't high. So hot water, a heater, not leaky roof. Those kind of things are, it's pretty expressed in the health and safety code here in California. So the standards there, it's not, it's a minimal standard. If you're not minimal standard, there's got to be an issue. Either you're not communicating with your tenant, or you're not being present enough. So and sometimes it is the tenant's fault. The tenant's the one causing or being difficult, and so we experience that. So I can't always blame it on the property owner, because sometimes it is the tenants. Sometimes it's a combination of two, and sometimes you have two strong personalities fighting each other. You're like, hey, I want to fix this because you complain about it. Well, I'm going to sue you, and da da da. And then it just becomes a civil issue between both of them. And then unfortunately, code enforcement gets sucked into it, and it happens, and I see why it's a turnoff for a lot of code enforcement divisions to get involved in those things. I 100% see it, but at the same time, we do have a due diligence to make sure people live in a habitable housing condition. So, all right, let's move on. Let's see, Miss Celia. Yes, get to know your communities. They are so essential. And she laughed about some. Yes, got to know your craft. There you go. You got Miss love that Cecilia. Okay, they're having a love spat over there. I agree, haha. So sorry, my typo. 1790 Yes, that is the housing code. So let me see, Anthony. Thank you. Okay, we're almost down to our. So as long as they can be there and haven't been evicted yet, we should be able to inspect. Is what we practice. Yes.
Yeah.
As long as they're there, we can inspect. Correct. As long as we have consent to enter or a warrant, we're good to go. So yes, rewarding when you get compliance for the property owner and the tenants have a safe and healthy home. 100%, Cynthia. Yes. Okay. Here's our last comment. Hearing that, thank you for the best of them. All right. Cool. Awesome. So we're all caught up. All right. Cool. All right. So now, So if you guys haven't, you guys never heard of the People's Resource Center. So Jorge does do, has a YouTube channel. The People Resource Center has a YouTube channel where Jorge is the star of it. He does a quick meditation on wellness, which is very important. And then he talks about things like tenant responsibilities. So we're going to go through some of your videos and talk a little bit about them. I'm not going to play them, but we'll talk like tenant responsibilities, like nuisances. You had a video on that. Can you tell us a little bit about that video?
Sure. I think it's important to not only talk about what the tenant's rights are as far as advocating toward the owner of the property or the manager of the property, but also giving them a sense of what the expectation is of them as a tenant in entering into this unit, into this relationship with the owner. And so the last video and the next few videos are going to be around tenant responsibilities. And so the video was about it's the tenant's responsibility not to be a nuisance, not to cause damage to the property, not to do any illegal activity in the unit, and not to commit waste, right? And so I think that it's important for them to know about these responsibilities so that they know what's expected of them, but also so that they can understand that expectation is also transferred to their neighbors. Right. So if there is a neighbor that is playing loud music, doing construction after hours, or on the weekends, or is just leaving their trash sort of laying around, or is not throwing it in the dumpster, that they know that it's their responsibility to do that. And as well as if they get a complaint from another neighbor that maybe they're playing their music too loud, or they're also doing these things, that it is the expectation of them as well, so that people have an understanding of what to expect of one another, so that we're more neighborly and we're more understanding, and that folks are going into it sort of like with eyes wide open, and not just getting caught offside. Like right now, specifically because of COVID, there's all these tenant protection laws that are in place in LA County and in different cities within the county. And one of the reasons that's allowed for eviction is around nuisance, right? So I think it's important for tenants to understand what people mean by nuisance and what all that entails, so that they can avoid that, and then they can sort of avoid some sort of reason for eviction, right? So we want to share not only what their rights are, but what their responsibilities are as well.
Yeah, so COVID was a tough enforcement period. I was still in local city government, and people were using COVID as an excuse not to pay rent or to do this. And I'm like, hey, rent's a whole different issue. If it's something substandard or that may endanger somebody's health or safety, we have to act. We don't really, the eviction portion is like, hey, that's not my business. My business is it dangerous today? And if the answer is yes, I'm going to act on it. I'm going to do the proper write up. Everything is status quo. Whether the eviction happens, that's not my concern. That's a civil issue between you and the tenant. But one of the things that when you talk about this, we tend to deal with a lot of property owners, and property owners tend to like try to wiggle themselves out. And we're like, hey, you know what? There's things that you can do. If it's your tenant's the problem, in your lease, you should maybe explore, putting something in there like all the tenants must obey all city, state, county, federal laws. Because a lot of times if you're violating, I'm gonna give you an example. In the Hispanic community, sometimes it happens. People have like restaurants running out of their apartment, or they're, and we like, hey, we're getting reports like I can't get them out because of COVID. I'm like, well, you know what? They still need to follow all state, federal guidelines. County says you need a health permit to you run a restaurant. You need X, Y, Z. So if that's grounds for eviction, that's your deal. But you, property owner, are responsible for this. If you're allowing this to happen, you're just as equally responsible. Yeah, I'm going to deal with this person, but I'm also going to deal with you since you're the property owner. So a lot of times the property owner and the tenant both have to take responsibility and to ensure that they follow all codes and regulations. Sometimes it's the property owner, the tenant, they're not reporting something. For example, there's a leak. They're not reporting the leak because they don't and this is, and it's sad to say, I'm gonna say it, but a lot of times in the Hispanic communities, they don't want to, like cause trouble or get their rent raised, so they don't report certain conditions, and it just escalates and gets worse. And and then
Yes.
the property owner is like, hey, you could have told me when I had a little leak. Now it's this big gaping hole on the roof, and you're not, now I'm forced to fix it, and I can't afford it. And at the end of the day, me as a code officer, I'm like, look, I understand. However, this is your property.
Right.
You're responsible to fix it. If you're feeling there's some negligence on the tenant's part, that's something that you're gonna have to deal with to tenant. But today,
Yeah.
that needs to be repaired.
No, and I totally get that. And I think like in my experience, again, most of my experience has been with Long Beach code enforcement, and some of like the code officers, like you may, whether they're new, they might be new or whatnot, is it's all about, I think it's all about perspective. Is, and if the owner, you're dealing with the owner, and the owner's like telling them all these things about the tenant, is like, oh, they're not paying rent, they're not doing this. It's like, for all they know, the code officer, for all they know, they might be just advocating for their rights,
Yeah.
right? And if the code officer is not familiar with the tenant rights, then they might start to build this negative picture of the tenant, and seeing them more of an adversary, or an aggressor than an actual ally. And so I think if code enforcement was more informed on what tenants' rights are, they wouldn't be maybe so quick to judge or to criticize a tenant for whatever situation they might be in. For example, one of the videos that we've made is about the tenant's right to withhold rent if repairs are not getting made. It's in state law. It's the tenant's right to withhold 100% of the rent if repairs are not made after being requested and given reasonable amount of time. Right. And so if the tenant is withholding rent, they might be advocating for their right. But if a code enforcement officer might take that in and be like, oh, then they're just a bad tenant. And then they're probably the cause of these issues, and not so much, the person, the victim. And so I think the perspective has a lot to do with it. And I think that perspective is influenced by what we know and what we understand. And so if we can't be empathetic to the tenant situation as well as the owners, I said, then there's going to be a huge disconnect. And I think it might make things harder. But if you're more empathetic to the contextual situation of the tenant and what the tenant might be going through, like you said, it's like, if a small leak is so scary to report out of fear of being perceived as a nuisance or as a complainer, and then you get your rent raised, and then or you get evicted because you're complaining, that's scary stuff, right? And it's understandable that somebody is not going to say anything. And then if you're a non-English speaker who just signed a contract in English, how are you supposed to understand what you signed? And so they might be, a lot of these folks, just out of the mere necessity of having a place to live for them and their family and their children, they get into situations and they try to hold on to them with dear life, because the only other option is being out on the street. It's like, so they're going to just keep quiet, not cause any trouble. They're not going to say nothing. But then they find, just like you said, things start to snowball, and then they find themselves in a really bad living situation that is bad for them, and it's bad for the owner now as well. So I think education and information is key, is what we try to do. Is like, some people don't even know that a torn window screen is a violation.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The simple things, like, but it's like, you go to these apartments and all these screens are torn down, they're non-existent, they're not even there, they're all bent up, and but they don't know to report that. They don't know to even ask for that as a repair. If the door isn't completely locking, or if their community gate doesn't completely lock,
Mm-hmm.
that's a safety issue,
Yeah.
right? So they don't know to report that, because they're not informed as to what those violations are. So I think as Cecilia mentioned in the comments, get to know your communities, build relationship with the communities, provide them with information, provide them with education, provide them with resources, and ensure that there are there are language speakers of their preferred language. There's so many times where we have Spanish speaking only tenants that are calling code enforcement, and they send a non-Spanish speaker out. How is the officer supposed to communicate with the tenant, ask questions, get answers, investigate, if they can't even communicate? So I think code enforcement officers and departments need to invest resources into ensuring that there's some sort of like language access, and there's some sort of language justice, so that you're able to communicate with the people that you're supposed to be going out and advocating for.
No, you're 100% right. And, one of the reasons why I wanted you on the show is because, you know what? You understand tenants' rights, and a lot of code officers don't. I sat there, a couple years ago, there was a tenant landlord's handbook. It isn't in print anymore, but it was such a good, yeah. Yeah, but it's such a good resource. It tells you about withholding rent and reporting issues and, evictions and, the kind of things that you should expect when renting. But it also gives landlords the guidelines to what they need to provide a tenant. It's a pretty good book. It was available in Spanish, no longer in print. It's available on PDF. I have a copy if anybody wants it or needs it. But it gives a lot of good information. A lot of code officers never take the time to read it. And to me, it's so important for you to understand, as a code enforcement officer, what the actions that you take today are going to happen tomorrow. Because you know what? I can go to your house and I see a roach infestation, and I can just go home on my merry way and never think about you again. But guess what? That family's stuck. That baby's stuck with the roach infestation. So, and growing up in a situation that I grew up in, back then in the 80s, the rent was only like $300 for a 1-bedroom apartment. You're talking about 1-bedroom apartment now. You're talking about $2,500, $1,500, $2,500 plus right now. So here we have another comment from, let me see, from Miss Christella Miles. Here in Texas, we have a language line. And what that means is language line solutions, to act as an interpreter. Oh, that's beautiful. And a lot of jurisdictions can take note. It's important to do that. I had a class, Spanish for code enforcement. I didn't teach Spanish in one day, but I taught very minimal on how to communicate, and understand those types of communities. Because, you as a code enforcement officer, you go to someone's house, you don't start, talking to the wife, you talk to the husband. So, you got to understand these little cultural barriers too. Say, like I said, I lived in Long Beach, so I knew the, you have an African-American area, you have a Filipino area, you have a Cambodian area, Vietnamese area, Chinese area. So you really have to know where you're at and what the culture is there, because a lot of times, there's body language barriers as well. You don't look, certain nationalities, you don't look at them in their eye. So you talk to them, women, you don't talk to them straight to their face. So, those are kind of things that code enforcement officers need to be cognizant of and also need to be aware of, especially another situation that I see that isn't really discussed is, a lot of times when you have these substandard structures, you do have a high criminal element in some of them, and so one of the things that I, advocate for is know your surroundings, because, you may have a substandard housing, but you may have, a gang member in the house, that, might, you start telling them, hey, you need to fix this and you need to fix that. And, you have somebody coming out angry and, potential with criminal elements. So these are things that you have to be aware of doing code enforcement in these substandard housing places. So now I know we're running out of time. See how fast it was? I told you it was going to go.
I know. It goes fast.
We have like 9 minutes left. But one of the things, so tell us what your role with Healthy Housing. For those that don't know, the California Healthy Housing, again, it's a collaborative with different folks. We have folks like Larry Brooks on there, Brandon Kitagawa. We have such amazing folks on that group that just kind of share information about what's going on, advocate for new bills in our state legislature to help people in these types of conditions. So now, what is the role of your type of organization in the California Healthy Housing Coalition?
Well, I think it's basically to help inform any potential legislation or bills that we want to sponsor or author from the tenant's perspective. I just want to ensure, because like so often so many laws and bills are put together and passed without the impacted people at the table helping to make those decisions, right? So I think I'm there as a representative of the community so that I can bring what I learn as far as the tenant experience to the table to make sure that that is helping inform some of these bills. Like, for example, right now, one bill that is being considered is around like ensuring that if there is one unit in a multi-unit building that has code violations, then it becomes the responsibility of the officer to knock on a certain percentage of those doors, right, of that building. Because more often times than not, in my experience, is that like if one unit's got roach infestations, chances are the other unit's got roach infestations, right? So if you're already there, and I know that this is like this it brings into the question of like resources and what code enforcement departments have as far as resources, but I think it'll help inform sort of like it'll help all of us out, I think, that kind of bill. But I want to like bring in the tenant experience into that space, because this is a space that is collectively, as you mentioned, all these jurisdictions across the state that are putting together these bills and trying to push them forward. And so I just want to make sure that the tenant voice is heard.
So there's a question: is your organization, the People's Resource Center, only in the SoCal area? And this is from a code enforcement officer in Salinas, California. I'd love to be able to connect and work together in my area on the Central Coast. She apologized for coming in a little bit late, but the California Healthy Coalition is a statewide organization, and so there's different groups. I've worked with groups in Fresno. I've worked with your groups. So there's groups up and down the place. But specifically to your question, does your group work in the central area?
The People's Resource Center is right now is just SoCal focused.
Yeah.
This is mainly because we're brand new. We just have a couple of staff, and we're doing what we can with what we got. Since we're a nonprofit, we have to seek out grant funding to be able to build and expand. Happy to to be able to offer any kind of uh, just advice or counsel or connect to other groups possibly in the Central Coast area, other tenant groups that you might be able to, like, if that's what you're looking for. But if you were talking about the California Healthy Housing Coalition, that's statewide, and anybody that's interested in healthy housing or indoor air quality can be a part of that.
And one of the things that when I connected with Jorge was, what, I saw his different perspective. And a lot of times, we're you guys don't really see how you can be allies in seeking our missions, because my job is to make sure that people live in health and safety housing, and his job is to ensure the health and safety housing. And we're just causing, a lot of times folks say, hey, we're just causing work for each other. But guess what? At the end of the day, the result is the same. We're providing healthy housing for somebody that needs it. And that's the end of the goal. And bringing these different perspectives, sometimes people disagree, and that's what the Healthy Housing Coalition is about. Because how do we meet a happy medium to make sure our bills and our agendas are met with positive feedback? Because the worst thing you want to do is code enforcement say, hey, we want to do this, and then you have Jorge's group saying, no, we don't want that, we want this. So if we come collaboratively to understanding before we present these bills, and we have advocates on both sides, it makes it more palatable for the legislature to say, hey, this is a good bill. I'll give you an example. A couple years back, code enforcement, we are now able to deem pest infestation and mold as a substandard. It wasn't there before. So bed bugs, that's another issue that we help pass. Mold, lead. I mean, there's so many substandard housing now. This new law, AB 838, that says, hey, if you receive a complaint, guess what? You have to respond. And that's probably based on a lot of code officers not doing what they're supposed to do and go out to these places. Now, a lot of things can be solved by having a proactive rental housing inspection program. But you know what? A lot of times jurisdictions don't have the resources. They don't know where to start. We've helped set up places and to help them, establish their rental housing inspection programs, because there's like I said, sometimes people don't know that air gaps, may cause moisture, which cause, maybe your vent in the bathroom isn't working, so your moisture is causing mold on your walls. So these are little things that can be remedied to help these long-term effects. So when we go out there proactively and look for things, we don't want to cause extra financial strain on property owners, but say, hey, if I see something like the torn screen, I'm like, if I see like a hole, I'm like, all right, whatever. But we use our discretion. We use more of the spirit of the law. And so if we see a leak that's could potentially be causing, it is what it is. We're like, hey, you should fix that because it's going to cause a long term like damage to your subflooring. So we see these things. So us as code enforcement officers, we should be able to see these, understand the long term repercussions of poor maintenance, and be able to articulate that to the tenants and say, hey, tenants, you should be reporting this to your property owner, or property owner, hey, during our routine inspection, this is what we encounter. We advise you to take these steps to remedy. And and there's always that saying, pound, what do you call it? Ounce of prevention is a pound of cure. So a lot of times that's 100% true. So Jorge, other things that we see, let me see, withholding rent, in regards to California law, withholding rent, repairing and deducting. Can you talk a little bit about that? Just really, I know we're running out
Sure.
of time, so we're
Yeah,
there.
there's so much. I could talk about this for hours. There's so
Yeah.
much to talk about. But yeah, I mean, as it relates to habitability, we try to follow sort of like a slow escalation process when we're working with tenants. At first, like you said, documentation is so important. We tell people that you have to document this, and I don't know how. It's unfortunate that the documentation that tenants do in the home cannot be shared with code enforcement officers. At least in our experience, it can't be, because the code enforcement officer has to be the one to actually see the things. But like sometimes we have like videos of rats and mice and things like that may not show up when the inspector's there. But we can't use that information to help further along the situation. So documentation, we tell them document, write a letter. And we try to do is, like I said, because when one unit has an issue, it's very likely that another unit has an issue. So we try to knock on the doors of the neighbors and trying to find out to see, are they having similar issues? And if they do, then we encourage them to write a collective letter, like to write a letter together, because one letter together is much, much stronger than one single individual. So then you send the letter, you wait a reasonable amount of time. If that doesn't happen, that's when we enact code enforcement. And then if code enforcement comes in, does their inspection, and there's still no response, then we advise them of their rights on what choices they can take. They can either repair and deduct themselves according to state law, or they can withhold 100% of the rent, or they can repair and then sue in small claims court. So, but these are choices that the tenants are going to have to make, because they're risky, right? Because as soon as you start to withhold money from the owner, they're going to get real mad.
Real fast,
so
yes.
they'll try to take actions like to evict and things like that. So we advise them with some caution, but we try to take all of these other steps first before reaching that point, because I think that the tenants have to do their due diligence and just take the steps necessary first.
And we do talk, a lot of times when it's something, when it has to do with discrimination, when you're getting retaliatory, evictions on those things, we do refer them saying, hey, maybe you need to talk to legal aid, or you need to talk to fair
Yeah.
housing, because
Yes.
they do have their own, they have their own protocols to assist tenants. You have your advocacy group that's there to inform them and educate them and help them out. But you have other legal resources that you can do, like legal aid. There's a lot of places out there that specifically help tenants out there. A lot of pro bono attorneys that do that.
Yes.
There's a lot of stuff that we can do now. Just kind of ending on a note, I think, the more we educate the public, and this is a commitment that I make. When I talk to some of these folks like yourself, I'm like, I want to continue to work with you in educating the public. And in Spanish, like I said, I have a a good slew of people to assist me to, reach out and say, hey, you shouldn't be scared to call code enforcement because we're here to
Yes.
help. We're not here to, punish you or, or put you against your landlord. We're here to assist you to make sure you live in a habitable space. Because at the end of the
Absolutely.
day, we sleep better at night. Our communities are better, and I've dealt with garage conversions that caught on fire and somebody lost their life. And, that's something that, I mean, it wasn't my fault, but, I wish I could have done something sooner, and
Yeah.
these are kind of things that us as code enforcement officers, we can say, hey, you know what, we did the best that we could to help that situation out. And, and we can sleep better at night for it. So,
Yeah.
we have a tough job, you have a tough job. We see some of the gnarliest stuff out there, and we
Yeah.
really
Yes.
appreciate you coming on, and we'll definitely invite you on again to talk about some other cool tenant rights stuff. So, but with that, I really appreciate your time, and thank you for coming on today. And I'm sorry we missed Rachel, but she had to
Yeah.
be, but she really was looking forward to this conversation. So,
Yeah. This was great. Thank you so much, Pete. It was great
oh,
to be
no
on.
problem, no problem. Well, everybody, we will see you next week, and we really appreciate your time and dedication to our show. Thank you. All right, bye.